This is the Matsuda deconstructed guitar, and it's one of the nicest, most unique instruments I've ever played. It's also by far the most expensive guitar I've ever owned. I'm going to be featuring this guitar a lot on the channel moving forward because it's really inspired me musically, but today's video is actually in celebration of June 6th, also known as World String Change Day. So I'm going to put some new strings on while telling you the story of how I got this very unique guitar. We'll also talk about my favorite strings for different styles of guitar, and I play a lot of unique strings, so I'm sure there's something here that you haven't tried yet. Now, if you didn't know, World String Change Day is a really cool holiday started by D'Addario, and it happens every June 6th. And the whole point of this holiday is just to remember to change your strings and to maybe even experiment with some different types of strings. So yeah, try some unique strings, post a video on it on YouTube or on Instagram, and make sure you hashtag World String Change Day because there will be different giveaways, announcements, and so on. Check out the D'Addario Instagram for more info. And throughout this video, you'll be seeing me use tools from this D'Addario string change kit that they sent me. I have had some of these tools before, just randomly sitting around, but it's really nice just to have it all in one convenient package like it is today, especially when it comes to this nut lubrication kind of a thing. I've used other nut lubes in the past, and they all basically do the exact same thing, but the issue is that they usually come in very, very tiny containers, and I end up losing them. So this larger syringe along with the carrying case, this is going to be great for me. And I'll of course link everything that I'm using for the string change below. So a big thank you to D'Addario for having this holiday, sending me these strings and this string change kit. And another huge thank you to the Archtop Foundation for allowing me to use this guitar. And we'll talk a lot more about the instrument and the Archtop Foundation when I explain how I got this guitar a little bit later in the video. Okay, so let's talk about strings. So for those of you who don't know, I play primarily a mix of jazz and blues type stuff, usually on a clean tone or a slightly distorted tone, and I occasionally play a little bit of metal for my own fun. Now, the vast majority of the time, I'm actually using flat wound strings, and you may not have even noticed this in the past, but sometimes I even play metal with flat wound strings and no one ever notices in the comments. So clearly, flat wound strings can be used for a lot more than just the typical jazz archtop stuff. I've played and experimented with different flat wound strings for, again, a long time. We're talking about well over a decade here, and usually flat wound strings are pretty expensive by some brands. There are a couple of other brands that make them also pretty cheap. What I found is that the D'Addario chromes, for me at least, are the best combination of affordability and quality. Some of the cheapest flat wound strings don't have that same smooth feel that you get with the D'Addario chromes. And I've also tried some of the really expensive flat wound strings that are like $50, $60 per pack. And I honestly didn't find that those were any more special than the D'Addario chromes. So for me, these are just the best strings in terms of how they sound, how they feel, and also the affordability for flat wound strings. Now, if you're wondering why I use flat wound strings, it's a combination of how they sound from a tone perspective and also because I am very, very picky about string noise. Some guitarists don't care about string noise at all. Some even like to amplify the string noise. So while they're in the studio, they'll record the actual electric guitar with a microphone so that they can mix in some of the sound of the fingers on the strings. I personally despise string noise. So that's one of the reasons why I use flat wound strings. And some people say that, oh, it's just a technique thing. You don't have to have string noise when you're playing guitar. But the simple fact is, if you want absolutely zero string noise, which I personally do, then you have to use flat wound strings. There's no way around it. So yeah, it's not like I can't perform a gig with round wound strings or that I sound so sloppy and bad with round wound strings, but I play a lot for myself and for my own pleasure in addition to teaching, of course. So I just like things to sound how I want them to sound. have the full arrangement at the end of the video, and of course, if you want to learn how to play anything from jazz to blues, solo guitar, and even if you don't like jazz or blues and you just want to learn your modes, scales, arpeggios, picking, chords, etc. in the most efficient manner possible, check out my course link below. So we get rid of the string noise with the flat wounds, and then we also get a warmer, rounder tone in my opinion, and I really, really love that. I tend to like a bassier tone in general. Now, there are times when I use round wound strings. For example, my PRS Mark Holcomb guitar is set up for metal playing, and my Abasi Concepts ME6 guitar is also set up for metal playing, so I have regular strings on there. For those guitars, I use the NYXL by D'Addario as well. I don't use the NYXL strings because I personally feel like they sound so much better than the regular D'Addario strings. I use them because I found that they last a lot longer than any other string that I've personally tried. And I notice this most when I'm playing with guitars that have stainless steel frets. I remember a period of time when I was exclusively playing stainless steel fret guitars, and I was working on a lot of really big bends and vibrato stuff. And with other brands, I would literally break a string at least once every other day. So we're talking going through 3 or 4 high E strings a week. And when I switched to playing the NYXLs, I still got string breaks, but they were far, far less common. We're talking about 1 string break every month instead of 3 or 4 a week. And for that reason, I use the NYXLs whenever I have a guitar where I'm doing a lot of whammy bar stuff or where I plan on doing a lot of big bends. By the way, I also really love this new D'Addario tuner that I'm using for this setup. I was using a different D'Addario tuner in the past that I will leave on the headstock, and I like this small one because I can turn it backwards and then the audience can't see me using it while I tune, which is a little idiosyncrasy that I learned in music school. They used to always tell us to take these headstock tuners off the headstock before we perform, but with these tiny D'Addario tuners, you can have them on the headstock and no one can see them. The one thing I don't love about these small D'Addario tuners is that you have a replaceable battery. Whenever possible, I like rechargeable batteries, and the version you see me using in the video right now is actually rechargeable, and it's rechargeable via USB-C. Love this tuner as well. And finally, when I'm playing acoustic guitar, I also don't use normal round wound acoustic guitar strings, and I found these D'Addario flat tops, phosphor bronze acoustic guitar strings back when I was doing my undergraduate degree, so we're talking about 2010 to 2014. That's when I switched over to using flat wound strings on my electric guitars, but I couldn't find another company that made a flat wound string for acoustic guitars. So when I found these, I basically never looked back, and since then, I exclusively play these strings when it comes to my acoustic guitars. So here's a quick clip of me playing these strings back in like 2014 at my senior recital. So I'm still new to this instrument and I'm going to be doing a lot more research on it before I make a full video, but I'll tell you a few things right off the bat. This is a deconstructed guitar made by the Japanese luthier Michihiro Matsuda. As you can imagine, it's completely handcrafted from some of the most beautiful woods. I mean, look at the flame on this neck. Of course, the fretwork is perfect. It's smooth. I mean, everything you would imagine about this guitar feels perfect. I know it looks a little bit funky, but when it's actually on your body, it's extremely comfortable, and it's also surprisingly loud acoustically. I'm not exactly sure why the guitar is so loud acoustically. It might have to do with some of the way it's built. As you can see, there are these little canals and valleys within the instrument itself, so that might help with that acoustic projection, but it's of course made to be played amplified and it sounds amazing there as well. One small detail that I like is that it's actually not like a normal headless guitar. The headstock kind of looks like a Parker guitar, as you can see here, but it's almost like you took the entire neck off of a guitar and reversed it so that the strings lock at the top and go to the tuner in the rear, which is what you can see right here. And yeah, it's unique, it's amazing, it's beautiful. We're going to be playing a lot of music on this guitar while I have it. More on that later. But let's talk about actual string gauges, because in my opinion, string gauges, well, this is a very underrated topic that guitarists don't really talk about much. So although the Dario makes a lot of different options when it comes to the flat wound chromes strings, they don't make a set that fits with my particular idiosyncrasies perfectly. And so for many, many years now, I've been buying the flat wound strings as individual strings and mixing and matching to make my own set for my guitars. Now, when it comes to string gauges, a lot of guitar players like to pick a gauge based on how they believe it sounds. I'm not saying that's right or wrong, but for me, the thing that I care most about in a string gauge is number one, how the strings sound in relation to each other, and number two, how the strings actually feel and how easy or how difficult they are to play. So in terms of how the strings sound in relation to each other, I think of a singer. One of the goals if you're a singer is to have your voice sound consistent and clear and full and powerful from your lowest note all the way to your highest note. And I think of the guitar the same way. When I move from playing a bass line on the low E string to the A string, I don't want it to sound like I switch strings. I want it to sound like one consistent tone. And the same thing applies when I'm playing a solo and I'm on the high E string and then I go to the B string and then the G string. I want it to all sound like one consistent, clear voice, almost like the guitar is just one string and a super long fretboard that goes from, the low open E string sound to the high E 24 fret sound. And so to achieve that, I spent a lot of time playing different string gauges and listening to how they sound as we go through the octaves. And I basically have two different gauges that I use depending on how the guitar feels, the scale length, and things like that. For my low E string, I like to use a 45 or a 42. For my A string, I like to use a 35 or a 30. For my D string, I like to use a 28 or a 24. And when it comes to flat wound strings, they usually have a wound string on the G string. That tends to be the preference for jazz guitar players. But I like to use an unwound string for the G string so that it sounds more similar to the B and the high E string. So when I go to my plain strings, I actually use NYXLs that I bought separately. So again, I buy each string individually, the flat wounds, and then I buy individual NYXL strings as well, usually. And for my G string, it's usually a 16. For my B string, it's usually an 11 or something around 11. And then for my high E string, it can go anywhere from 8 all the way to 10, depending on the guitar. So there's a bit of variation there. Now, if you play archtop guitars or if you play acoustic guitars, you're going to be thinking to yourself that that's a super light string gauge for an archtop guitar, and you're right. I tend to like an even lighter string gauge on an archtop guitar. In fact, when I set up this guitar and tried it, I realized that I might have to actually go a little bit lighter. So maybe I'll move to a 42 on the low E string and a 30 on the A string. I'll have to see and experiment. But my whole thing is that archtop guitars and acoustic guitars in general are a little bit harder to play than an electric guitar, normal electric guitar. So if I'm amplifying this archtop guitar, this lovely Matsuda, there's really no point in me trying to get a super heavy gauge of string that's going to sound better acoustically. So I might as well kind of set up the guitar for ease of playing when amplified. And for me, that means lighter string gauges. Now, when it comes to purely acoustic guitars, I just go with the lightest gauge that the Dario offers for the flat tops. I think that's 10 to 47. And when it comes to my NYXL and my round wound strings, this is actually an area where I use a heavier string gauge, because when I have my Abasi Concepts ME6 or any of my other really nice guitars that I'm super lucky to own, these guitars are set up with such low action and they're so easy to play anyway. Having a super light string on a super easy to play guitar can actually feel a little bit too easy to play, if that makes sense, especially when I'm doing more legato style playing. So I'll usually use a set of 10s on those guitars. And if I'm going to be doing drop tunings and things like that, I'll go even lower on the low E string than a normal set of 10s. Okay, so now that we covered all of our string talk, I want to tell you the story of how I actually came about borrowing this Matsuda guitar. Spoiler alert, I don't own it and I didn't pay $25,000 to buy it myself. Just in case it wasn't clear, I'm still pretty much broke and I still live in this basement apartment. So the story starts almost a full year ago when I met the guys over at the Archtop Foundation. They're also responsible for the blue guitars if you've seen that. It's basically a set of beautiful Archtop guitars that are all blue, made by these different really, really amazing builders over the years. Now, the whole idea behind the Archtop Foundation is that all of these really beautiful, rare, high-end guitars, they shouldn't be behind museum glass. They shouldn't just be in collectors', vaults. They should actually be in the hands of guitar players who are making music and getting joy out of playing the guitars, which makes a lot of sense. I mean, if you think about it from a car example, if you have a really expensive Lamborghini or a beautiful Maserati, the idea of it just sitting in your garage and rotting away and not being driven is kind of crazy. You would hope that someone would actually drive the car and use it in a way that it was designed for. And so that's what the Archtop Foundation is doing. They're getting these beautiful, rare, high-end guitars into the hands of players, which is, again, an amazing thing. So I hooked up with those guys about a year ago. We were just chatting about different things. And a year passes and we hadn't connected in a while. And they told me about an event they were having in Brooklyn, New York City. I live in Jersey City, New Jersey, which is right outside of New York City, but I work in Manhattan. So I'm constantly commuting between the two. And I went to school in New York when I was growing up and for college. And so, yeah, I'm constantly commuting between these two places anyway. So the Archtop Foundation told me they were going to be having this really nice private event in Brooklyn where they're inviting different guitar players to come and try some of these different guitars that are basically part of an amazing collection. And I didn't really understand what there was going to be besides that, because this is the first type of event I'd ever been to in my life like this. So I figured, oh, okay, that's an amazing opportunity for me to just go, maybe record some video, play a few guitars and go back home. That's what I thought. So maybe a month passes or so and it's time for the event. But the unfortunate thing is that in May, when this happened, I got really, really sick, at least for me. Usually I don't get sick to begin with. And if I do get sick, I have like a sore throat or a runny nose for a day or two, and then I'm back to normal. But in this case, I was so sick that I was basically stuck in bed for almost 2 straight weeks, which is totally unheard of for me. I don't think I've ever been that sick since I was like a child. Now, I'm totally fine. I don't have any, anything that's chronic or long-term or anything like that. I just got a really, really bad virus or bug of some sort. But the event was happening actually right towards the end of me being sick. I was no longer contagious, but I still wasn't back in work and I still felt like absolute garbage. So the event was on a Wednesday, and I remember that Sunday night, I was like, okay, I still feel pretty bad now, but I'm no longer contagious, and I bet by Wednesday I'll be back on my feet. So Sunday came and went. Monday, I was still in bed all day. Tuesday, I was still in bed all day. And Wednesday morning came and I'm like, oh my God, I still feel really, really crappy. Again, I'm not contagious and, I can technically get up and walk, but boy, oh boy, I just feel like garbage. And so I was even preparing to email them, the Archtop Foundation, or send them a text message and be like, hey, I really appreciate you inviting me to the event, but I just can't make it. I'm really sick. And maybe I'm going to say 10 minutes before sending the email, I decided, you know what? I'm just going to have some coffee, take some Tylenol. I'm just going to get up and go, and I'll go for an hour and then I'll just leave afterward. So I go to the event and I totally misunderstood what this event was actually going to be. So I walk into this, Brooklyn studio type room, and all around the room, there are a crazy amount of rare guitars. I'm talking about Martin and Gibson acoustics from like the early 1900s. There's like a dozen of them. I'm talking about Archtops from the 1960s and 1970s. There was even a Tele from the 1950s. So it's just this room with dozens and dozens of some of the most amazing and unique and rare guitars you'll ever see. Mostly flat top acoustics and arch top guitars. And as people started to come to the event, I started seeing guitar players that are just really, really talented and famous. The type of guys who like gig regularly in New York City in the jazz scene. And I'm like, oh my God, I don't belong here. I mean, at one point, Julian Lage just walks into the room casually, and I'm like, Jesus, I don't belong in this room. This is just kind of strange for me to even have been invited to this. I'm very grateful, of course, but like, I felt very much out of place hanging out with these guys. Out of all of these guitars in the room, mostly arch tops, mostly the acoustics, there is the Matsuda. And this is probably the weirdest guitar in the room because, as you can see, I mean, it looks funky. It's an arch top, but it's kind of a headless design, and it's a modern thing, whereas the rest of them were all vintage guitars for the most part. And so, of course, this is the guitar that caught my eye the most because you guys know me, I like strange, unique, beautiful, but unique guitars. And don't get me wrong, I would love to try a vintage arch top, but if we're being honest, the thing that I'm most known for and the thing that I most love are these modern, unique kind of guitars. So as I'm feeling both sick and delirious and also totally out of place in this room with these amazing guitars and these amazing guitar players, the guys at the Archtop Foundation then give an announcement that people are going to be able to borrow these guitars for a period of time. I'm feeling sick, I'm feeling out of place, and I kind of half listen to this announcement. I leave the event after about an hour like I planned. I say bye to a few people and so on. So on my way home, I have to take a few trains to get back to Jersey City. I'm on my way home. My phone is actually dying, and I get through my first train. I then get to World Trade Center, and I get on the PATH train, which is the train that connects New York City to Jersey City. And right as my phone is about to die, I quickly check my text messages, and I get a text from my friend Andy Pitcher, who was also at the event. And he's basically like, hey, where are you? You won the Matsuda. And in my mind, I'm just like so confused about what just happened because, I know what the guitar is, but the word Matsuda is not in the front of my mind at all times for obvious reasons. It's not like Gibson or Fender. And so I'm just thinking like, what does he mean? And right as the doors for the PATH train are about to close to bring me to Jersey City, it hit me that, oh my God, I get to borrow this amazing archtop guitar, this Matsuda. And so I run off this PATH train, my phone dies right at that moment, and I get back on the train to Brooklyn, and I get back to the event, and sure enough, I get to borrow this guitar. And they explained to me that basically you get to borrow it for a full year, which is, to me, I mean, it's insane. I just can't believe that I get to play this guitar for a full year. And, they encourage you to write music and things like that. And I plan on doing some recordings with it, of course. At this point, I'm overwhelmed. I'm still tired. I'm still feeling sick, but I'm also really excited. And here's the funniest part. So they put the Matsuda in this case, which is this ginormous, heavy, awkward industrial flight case. And so I'm carrying this thing home, feeling sick. And the whole time it's just smashing into my leg and giving me so many bruises on my leg because it's just awkward to carry. And I don't know. I just found the whole thing really funny and crazy and unique. It's just, I don't know. It's one of those things in life that makes you think about just how lucky you are and how beautiful this world is. Because here I am, some just average guitar player. I become somewhat known on YouTube for liking Parker guitars, which are modern guitars, and then at some point Stramberg guitars, which are headless guitars. As a result, I get invited to this event that I had no business being at. And the guitar, out of all the guitars in the room, the guitar that I get to borrow is the modern headless guitar, which is the perfect guitar for me to play and to share with you all on YouTube and to make music with. And yeah, just an amazing event. Amazing people, amazing instruments, and I feel so honored and lucky to have this instrument for a period of time. So again, a huge thank you to Dario for sponsoring this video. I like to do the last bit of my setup actually seated. I know that we have this fancy guitar measurement tool to figure out the string height and things like that, but that's not what I do. I just basically put it on my lap and adjust until it feels right to me. So we're going to do that now. They, of course, still need to be broken in properly. I like flat wound strings when they're about a month old. I think they sound best from then until the end of their life, but we'll get a sound of how it sounds.